Hello, I'm Jan Shravinsky. Welcome on board the Eastern Express. As always, I hope you enjoy the journey. This time around, we dive into the bizarre and outright baffling world of Russian politics. We're going to explore the inner workings of the Russian power structure, an entity so convoluted it makes a supercomputer look like a paperclip. The military incursion by Ukrainian forces into Russian territory has revealed a lot about the Kremlin's inner circle. Now that I think about it, it's less of a circle and more a chaotic tangle of competing interests, personal loyalties and backstabbing. Not too dissimilar from the Game of Thrones then. So, let's get right into it. Here is our latest report.
The Ukrainian operation in the Kursk region has attracted a great deal of media attention. A large share of commentary has portrayed it as a spectacular success, proving that Ukraine has the upper hand in the war. At the same time, Russian forces have been making major progress in the Donbass. Russian troops are advancing towards the town of Pokrovsk and have created a bulge in Ukrainian lines. Their advance is considerably faster than other operations throughout the Donbass for most of the war.
First at the front line, our positions, primarily it is the Pokrovsk section, our Donetsk region. We understand the enemy's actions and we are strengthening our troops. We have checked the ammunition supply, and it is very important that our partners really fulfill their obligations. On each package, on all of our agreements, it is fundamental for our defense.
Additionally, Pokrovsk is the last major urban area between Russian forces and the Dnipro River. Seizing it would allow Russia to move its units rapidly across an open plain all the way to the outskirts of the city of Dnipro. Ukrainian operation in Kursk has led Russian command to redeploy some forces away from the Donbass, although not enough to halt offensive actions there. It remains to be seen if Kursk operation was Kiev's only plan or just a prelude to a major counterattack meant to stabilize the situation in the Donbass.
And now, as always, let's take a look at the issue in greater detail. And let's begin with Putin's response to the Kursk incident. In a move that surprised even us, Vladimir Putin appointed Alexei Dyumin, his former bodyguard, to take charge of the situation. Because when your country is invaded for the first time since World War II, who better to handle a military crisis than the guy who used to carry your umbrella? Dyumin isn't just any former bodyguard, though. He's also the secretary of the State Council, a title that sounds important, until you realize it's basically a glorified advisory role with no real power. Yet here he is, handling one of the most significant military crises Russia has faced in recent memory. This appointment isn't just eyebrow-raising. It's a giant neon sign flashing, "I don't trust my generals," in all caps. Putin's inner circle isn't just a tight-knit group of loyalists. Rather, it is a web of personal fiefdoms, each led by someone who owes their entire career to the man at the top. And these struggles aren't confined to the Kremlin. They are playing out across the Russian government, most notably in the military and security services. We've seen this at work earlier this year with the case of Sergei Shoigu. Just a few years ago, he was Putin's right-hand man, the defense minister with whom Putin would go on rustic Siberian retreats. But now, he's out of favor, and his allies are being purged from the Ministry of Defense like they've got the plague. The head of the General Staff, Valery Gerasimov, is hanging on by a thread after reportedly ignoring intelligence about Ukrainian troop movements before the Kursk debacle. Over at the FSB, Russia's main security agency, there is a full-blown power struggle happening as we speak. Longtime director Alexander Bortnikov is on his way out, and the jockeying to replace him is intense. Will it be his deputy, Sergei Korolev, who's been in the running for so long, he might as well be FSB's King Charles, artist formerly known as Prince? Or will it be Vladislav Menshchikov, the counterintelligence chief with a focus on military and industrial espionage? The answer, as always in Russia, depends entirely on what mood Putin is in when he makes the decision. After all, when you've eliminated all other decision-making processes, it all comes down to what's going on in the mind of one very isolated man. So what does it all mean for Russia's future? In a word, instability. Putin has spent 25 years dismantling every independent institution that could challenge his rule, replacing them with a system where real power is held by a few clans of his closest allies. It is a situation ripe for conflict, and the only thing holding it all together is Putin himself. And now here to shed more light on the issue is Taras Kuzio, Professor of Political Science at the University of the Kiev-Mohyla Academy. Hello and welcome to Eastern Express.
Good morning and thank you for inviting me.
So, everyone seems to be talking about the Ukrainian incursion into Russia's Kursk region, everyone that is, apart from the media in Russia itself. Would you say that it is true what one of the analysts has said recently, that the overall response in Russia has been invasion? What invasion?
Well, they would never use the word invasion, of course, because that's too provocative in Russian eyes. In the same way as the word war is banned in Russia, it can only be called a special military operation. You can actually go to jail for 5 or more years if you use the word war, and I'm sure that's the same with this phrase invasion. Putin does this every time. Every time there's a crisis, he goes to hide. He's a coward. He's not really a proper leader in that sense. You know, he projects this image of a macho, tough dictator, strong Tsar leader type of person, but in actual fact, whenever there's a crisis, he runs away, he hides, or he distracts himself. Just as a year ago when the leader of Wagner, Prigozhin, his troops were marching on Moscow, Putin fled. He wasn't seen for 2 days, the same thing. And here he's trying to sort of project some kind of normalcy by visiting republics like Dagestan, Chechnya, and a visit to Azerbaijan as well. But of course, this is a major crisis that can't be hidden. In fact, just yesterday evening, Ukrainian military intelligence hacked Russian TV channels and put on there information about this Ukrainian incursion into Kursk and the background to the this terrible war taking place and the huge number of casualties in Russia. So Putin would like it to be hidden and go away, but this isn't the Soviet Union. Today, that's impossible to do, and so he's kind of going to lose that fact. He's not going to be able to shove it away and hide it in a corner, as it were, because it's going to lead to cracks in his system.
Do you think that perhaps the reason for this approach to the situation is that Putin wants to pretend like it's just beneath him, that it's nothing to worry about, and that the situation is so trivial that he doesn't really need to care. He doesn't personally need to become involved because his men will deal with it at some point, and he will only step into the limelight later on, basically, to take all the credit for what was done. Could this perhaps be the reason why he's actually not showing himself in the media, or if he is visible, he's doing something completely different and pretending like there is nothing wrong happening at all in the Kursk region?
Well, he's trying to do that because that's the old Russian Soviet tradition, that it's not the fault of the Tsar or the Soviet leader, it's the fault of the boyars, the oligarchs or the officials or the military officers. It's never the fault of Putin. And sadly, the Russian population is been zombified to believe this as well. You rarely get Russian citizens complaining that this is the fault of Putin. He started this war. It's now come back as a boomerang inside Russia. And instead, they, like Putin, are blaming everybody else, military officials, corrupt civil servants, this, that, and the other. I don't think this can be indefinite, and eventually people are going to start pointing the finger at Putin. And we've already seen this a little bit on Russian state TV, where they are talking about it as a kind of a bit of a crisis. You know, Russia was supposed to go from conquering Ukraine in 3 days, and we've gone to a situation where Ukraine has conquered the Kursk region in 3 days. So I don't think that this is going to continue, this ability to sort of keep hiding from this. Putin is going to try that, but I'm doubtful that's going to be possible, because in the end, the buck falls on him. He's created this system, which is a very corrupt mafia state, and that's reflected in the terrible conditions in the Russian army and its incompetence, its inability to fight a far smaller country like Ukraine.
So as you've mentioned, in Russia, everyone seems zombified, and Russian leader Vladimir Putin, if not really running around and shouting, "I'm the bad guy," well, at least he is watching his very own world burn. Thing is, however, you've already mentioned also another thing, cracks on the surface. Would you say that perhaps at some point, members of society, ordinary people, will take notice that this is not exactly how it was supposed to be, but also that the facade that they were being shown in the media is indeed showing some cracks, and they will start to think, okay, so what's next? What if something like this happens in my region as well?
Well, this is the whole purpose of Ukraine's campaign, to bring the war back home to Russians. Russians have been acting like ostriches in the last 3 years. They've been sort of burying their heads in the sand and saying, we don't want to know anything about this war, go away, we want to continue to have our kind of lives and, you know, go to bars and enjoy ourselves. We don't want any responsibility for this. This has nothing to do with us. It's all to do with the guys in charge. Well, when Ukraine brings the war home by attacking energy facilities, by attacking military airfields, by launching incursions like in Kursk, the war comes home. And therefore, they can no longer keep hiding their heads in the sand. I think we shouldn't overestimate the ability of Russians to sort of rise up and overthrow this regime. I think it's far more likely that this regime will crack at the top in some kind of palace coup rather than some kind of popular, revolt. I mean, Ukraine in the last 30 years has had 3 popular uprisings: the Granite Revolution, the Orange Revolution, and the Euromaidan Revolution. I joke often on Twitter that Russia's last revolution was in 1917. The Russian people don't feel a sense of agency. They don't feel a sense that they can change anything, that they have power and willpower, which is the case if you are a European citizen like Polish people, Ukrainians. They feel they individually have agency, they have influence, they can do something, they can change. Russians have lost that. And in the last 24 years under Putin, the population has been not only zombified but so re-Sovietized, and they've bought into this imperial nationalism and anti-Western xenophobia. I think one of the most amusing aspects of this incursion is the fact that they again don't know how to explain it. How can a people, Ukrainians, who allegedly don't exist in Russian imperial nationalist propaganda, how can they invade us? How can they launch this very successful military occupation, an invasion? The only way they can explain that is by conspiracy theories, saying, this is not just Ukrainians, it's Polish troops as well, it's NATO troops, the United States and Britain helped to plan it. They cannot come to the acceptance that this was Ukrainians. The Ukrainians actually didn't tell the West about this impending incursion. So I think the Russians are kind of running around trying to find excuses, and they are not very good at actually bringing up good propaganda stories now to explain how Ukrainians were so successful in this operation.
So indeed, one of the commentators on Russian national TV was quoted as saying to all the other participants in the discussion that the most important thing right now is for everyone to shut up about this. One more question. You've mentioned that the Russian society lacks what we would call a sense of agency. Could it also be that it lacks a sense of solidarity, by which I mean people living in Moscow and St. Petersburg may actually look at these events, even if they see them in the media, and say, well, it doesn't really concern me because these are people living somewhere far away in the province. I don't really care. People living in villages, they are just peasants. I've got my money. I've got my expensive car bought in the West. It doesn't really change anything for me. So do you think that, ironically, even though there is this propaganda narrative that, you know, Russia is a great nation, there is no solidarity because, in fact, it is actually fragmented, and individual groups, well, basically, they go along their own business. As long as they are not affected, they are not going to act, including on the political front.
Well, let's immediately say that Russia is not a great power. I mean, the Russians believe it is, but if you look at in comparison to other rising great powers, India, China, Russia is a declining power. It's not a great power, even though the Russian people seem to want to believe this.
Of course, it's a media narrative.
Yes, it's a media narrative, and most Russians have bought into this mythology. But if you could look at every statistic, economic, social, demographic, military, Russia is simply cannot be classed. I mean, the joke was that Russia claimed at the beginning of this invasion that it had the second best army in the world, and now the joke is that it's got the second best army in Russia after Ukraine. So I think that what's interesting here is comparing Ukraine and Russia. In the last 30 years, much of the Western commentary in the media and in academia was that Ukraine was this very divided society between Russian and Ukrainian speakers, Eastern and Western Ukraine. There was no unity. If the country was invaded, it would disintegrate very quickly. This was a view not only held in Moscow, in the Kremlin, also was held in the West amongst many of these so-called Russian experts. Well, what we've seen since 2022, and especially since the invasion of Kursk, is that Ukraine is a far more united society than actually Russia, as you say. The Russians are looting other people's houses in their own neighborhood when those people have fled. I mean, can you believe the lack of kind of community consciousness? They are stealing from their neighbors. When Ukraine was invaded, Ukrainians did not steal from their neighbors when those neighbors fled from the Russian invasion. This is how Russian society is so degenerated and stagnated under Putin that anything goes. I remember the story, really amusing story, that Russians stole a lot when they were occupying Kiev region in February, March of 2022. They brought it back to Belarus. They sent it from Belarusian post offices back to Russia. Half of what they sent back to Russia was stolen by postal workers. This is the kind of country and system that they've got, that everybody is atomized. People don't have a sense of shared community. That can only come about when you have civic consciousness, a sense of national solidarity that you have in Poland, you have actually in Ukraine, because these military aggressions by Russia have brought Eastern and southern Ukrainians closer to Western Ukrainians. It's brought a greater sense of national community and national integration. You don't have that in Russia. And then you really do have this sense of, we don't give a damn what's happening in Kursk. We're just going to continue our lives here. And that creates problems for a fighting force. It doesn't give that fighting force a sense of drive and high morale, which you do have in the Ukrainian army.
So in a way, that's both a good and a bad thing. A good thing because it makes Russian society less efficient. But if anyone is counting on any sort of political revolt or a large-scale anti-Putin movement, well, this, as you've mentioned, is going to be quite difficult, at least for the time being.
Yes.
Taras Kuzio was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your expertise.
Thank you very much for inviting me. Bye-bye for now.
And now we're moving on to Eastern News Flash, a series of all the other stories from the East that you really don't want to miss. The Ukrainian parliament has ratified the Rome Statute, meaning that the country is now subject to the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court.
The treaty establishing the ICC was signed by Ukraine in 2000, but remained unratified until this Wednesday. Kyiv hopes the move will make it easier to prosecute Russian citizens for crimes committed on Ukrainian territory. The ICC deals with allegations of genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and the crime of aggression. The move will also give Ukraine a say in the election of judges to the court. The treaty's ratification was set by Brussels as one of the requirements for joining the European Union.
Ukraine's military intelligence agency warns that Russia is preparing a disinformation campaign, attempting to dissuade Ukrainian refugees from returning to their homeland.
According to Kyiv, the campaign focuses on trying to convince Western journalists to share the Russian view of the conflict. Some journalists have already been hosted on Russian-paid tours of occupied Ukrainian territory. The campaign reportedly also aims to present alleged Ukrainian war crimes committed in the Donetsk and Luhansk regions. Some 4.2 million Ukrainians live in the European Union. Among them are many men eligible for the draft, which Kyiv would like to see return home.
Azerbaijan has applied to join the BRICS group. The move came a day after Vladimir Putin's visit to the country.
The group focuses on establishing closer economic ties between its member states. BRICS has seen a renewed interest in recent years. Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran and the UAE joined earlier this year. BRICS is sometimes portrayed as a counterbalance to NATO and the European Union. It is, however, a significantly looser group, with no common defense policy or laws. Additionally, its member states include rivals engaged in low-level conflicts like India and China.
The Ukrainian parliament has approved a law regulating the status of foreign volunteers fighting in its armed forces. Many of them faced legal problems in Ukraine before that.
The law allows such volunteers, as well as their families, an opportunity to apply for residency permit and naturalization. This will be granted even if their documents are no longer valid. This is important as the Ukrainian armed forces includes units composed of citizens of states hostile to Ukraine, like Belarus and Russia. Many countries have laws prohibiting fighting in foreign armed forces, which means fighters could be prosecuted if they return home to sort out their paperwork. This is a problem particularly for Georgian soldiers fighting for Ukraine. The previous legal status has led to foreign soldiers having trouble accessing such basic services as healthcare or renting property.
And for this episode of Eastern Express, it's the end of the line. Please stay with us here on TVP World for more latest news and updates. I'm Jonasz Rewiński. Bye for now.